Chapter 10. The hills were getting quite steep, and Jason, beginning to breathe heavily as he worked his way over the rough, slippery, leafy terrain, wondered if he'd passed the prince's location. He frowned in annoyance at the ambiguity of the directions. In the woods behind the hamlet was becoming less and less helpful by the moment, as the woods seemed to expand around him. He reached the crest of another hill, glanced around, and stopped to rest his back against a tree, looking back down the slope he had just surmounted. It was then that he heard footsteps in the leaves, steady, measured steps, approaching him. He turned quickly around. It was Prince Ezra, on the other side of the hill, walking slowly into view, with his gaze unwaveringly fixed on Jason. Jason eased away from the tree and cautiously approached. Finally, they both came to a stop about 4 meters away from each other. All around them, the solemn tree stood tall and silent, as if they were grave officials supervising this meeting. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Finally, Jason made himself speak out, loudly and clearly. "I got your message. I want you to tell me why you asked me here." Prince Ezra smiled grimly. Well, that's the most assertive you've been since you arrived here." "So you just wanted to give me backhanded compliments?" "Clever, and I do enjoy that, but no." "Good," Jason said. "Then get on with it, Prince Ezra." The prince drew himself to his full height. "Jason Fields, I challenge your right to lead Griffyngrein in the rebellion. You are a mere child, an untrained, attention-starved, spineless nobody, and altogether unworthy of the honor, and I demand that you cease this deceptive campaign at once." Jason felt a wave of nausea, and then, suddenly clenching his jaw, he snapped. He was that sort of anger that made his vision flash strange colors and his muscles shake. "There it is," he shouted. "It's all out in the open, finally. Now it's my turn to speak my mind, and I say, get off my back. I was called here. I passed the test. The most profound magic in the kingdom says that I'm supposed to be here, and that just kills you, doesn't it? Some nerve you have, accusing me of deception, when you're the one sneaking around your own house in the middle of the night, drooling over someone else's belongings. No, I won't cease my campaign. If you want to do something about it, be my guest." Prince Ezra cast off his cape, revealing a long sword sheathed at his side. He drew it and pointed it at Jason. "Draw your weapon," he snarled. Jason simultaneously unsheathed his sword and threw off his cloak. The prince stared in disbelief. Jason was holding a standard Inger longsword. The sword of the kingdom was nowhere to be seen. "Where is it?" he finally managed to demand. "I left it behind," Jason said. "I know what you're up to. You don't just want me dead. You want the sword, and you think you can win it from me in a fight. You hope it will align with you then, but deep down, you know it won't. It doesn't matter how superior your swordsmanship is. The sword was meant for me." Smiling grimly at the shock on Ezra's face, he cast his weapon on the ground. "So, since we've gotten that out of the way, what now?" He rolled up his sleeves. "Are you going to let me go back to the hamlet in time for the ceremony, or are we going to have to settle this the hard way, on a level playing field? Surely it won't look good to your subjects if you kill an untrained child in a sword fight." Prince Ezra slowly lowered his sword. Jason turned and began to walk down the hill. It was very unpleasant to turn his back on Ezra, especially since he was well aware of what was coming next. He heard footsteps charging towards him and turned just as Ezra tackled him. Down the hill they tumbled, slamming into roots and stumps and rolling over prickly branches. Jason was half stunned when he reached the bottom, but he had a slight head start on the prince. Picking himself up, he ran towards the next hill. It was worth one more shot. Then he would show this Inger prince the damage a North Carolina country boy could do. He reached the next hill, and, slipping and sliding, rushed tumultuously down. But Ezra found a long trailing vine just beyond the crest of the hill and grabbed it, swinging out and sliding downward, no doubt burning his hands nastily. He tumbled to the ground at the bottom of the hill just as Jason did. A moment later they were in a fierce struggle on the forest floor. Ezra was bigger than Jason, but not by much, and Jason was tough and brawny from years of constant activity and heavy-duty farm chores. For a while, neither of them was clearly winning. Every time Jason broke free, he started to scramble away, but Ezra would always dive after him, and down they would both go again. Finally, Jason landed a devastating hook to Ezra's jaw that sent him to the ground for several stunned moments. Shooting pains traveled up Jason's arm to his shoulder. He had bought himself enough time to escape. His head spinning, he ran unsteadily away. But as he noticed for the first time that fog was setting in, he also realized that he had lost his sense of direction. Fighting the desperation inside him, he ran on anyway, doing his best to stay clear of the prince, who had already come to and was at his heels. The sky darkened from an oncoming storm. The fog grew thicker. The air grew colder. Jason was not going to make it to the Inger ceremony tonight. Change of scenes. It was 4:30. The banquet was to begin at 6. Jane was beginning to feel uneasy. As she and Margaret were on their way to get dressed, Jane knocked for the 5th time on Jason's door, only to hear nothing and to find the door still locked. "Where is he?" she wondered in exasperation. "Don't worry, Jane," Margaret soothed. "You know men don't take as long to get ready for a banquet as we do. He'll be here soon." "But I really wanted to talk to him about the ceremony," Jane sighed. "The ceremony is not complicated. Even if you do not get a chance to confer about it, you will do well, I assure you." Jane tried to listen to Margaret, and they continued down the hall. As Jane stepped inside her anteroom and closed the door, though, she couldn't help but feel another nervous twinge. This was all very unlike Jason. It did not bode well. Here we change scenes again. It was gloomy and quite dark now. Thunder rumbled threateningly in the distance. Jason didn't notice it. He was too busy making his way as quickly as he could through a perilous maze of jagged boulders, bent trees, and loose pebbles. Still followed closely by Ezra, he had been running for more than half an hour and was thoroughly lost. He wondered briefly if Ezra had any idea where he was. Jason glanced back at him again and knew that it wouldn't be long before the prince was upon him. He glanced to his left and suddenly cut in that direction in an attempt to throw Ezra off under cover of the fog. But he jerked to a halt and staggered back, pebbles rolling perilously under his feet and his balance thrown off, as he realized that the ground sloped drastically downward in that direction. He finally regained his balance, knowing that now, instead of buying himself some time, he had just closed the distance between him and the prince. He hurried on. It was 5:00. Jane was dressed in her gown and stood in front of the mirror arranging her hair. Thunder rumbled. She went to her window. As she gazed at the gloomy clouds, dread clutched at her heart. There was no use running any more. Jason, winded and fed up, stopped in his tracks and whirled around, bracing himself for another fight. The prince tackled him. As they hit the ground, the storm rushed over them, enveloping the forest in blackness, heralded by a brilliant flash of lightning and a deafening crack of thunder. Even as the rain began to pelt down, the boys wrestled furiously, both exhausted but still determined to win. As they tumbled over to one side, the ground sloped suddenly downwards. Losing their grip on one another, they slid rapidly through clusters of vines and shrubs, came to an abrupt emptiness, and in another sickening instant were plummeting through the air. They crashed into shockingly cold water and went under. Jason got a mouthful of the foul, salty stuff as he resurfaced. After a stunned moment, survival instincts kicked in, and he began to tread water. There was no way he was going to be able to get out where he was right now. The cliff from which he had fallen would be impossible to climb again. He would have to swim along the bank until he found somewhere that was low enough. His conscience forced him to look around for Ezra. A flash of lightning showed him, through a veil of heavy rain. He was struggling in the water just a few yards away. He seemed to be having trouble. Couldn't the prince swim? The storm, even angrier now, was churning up the water and peppering it with wind-borne sticks and dead leaves. A wave carried Jason closer to the prince. It was then that he saw what was wrong. Ezra was tangled in a mess of young vines that he had tumbled through on the cliff above. They had pinned one arm to his body and hampered the movement of one of his legs. He fought mightily to stay above the water, but as the lightning flashed and revealed the look of desperation on his face, he went under again. Inwardly furious at the fact that he felt obligated to save his enemy, Jason dove forward. Thrashing through the furious surges, he reached Ezra just as he bobbed back up and grabbed him with one hand. Ezra knew not to clutch at Jason. As frantic as he was, it would only take them both down. Jason tried to wrench some of the entangling vines off of the prince, but to no avail. It was extremely difficult to maneuver those tough, green, slippery things and stay afloat at the same time. Jason took one of the stronger vines and slipped his own arm through one of the tangles so that it slid fast around his shoulder. They combined their efforts to tread water. Debris from the storm was ripping past them, and the thunder and lightning raged on. Jason made some attempt to maneuver, throwing his weight forward and dragging them both along, but the tossing waves either threw them in a different direction or simply pushed them back to where they started again. He was beginning to despair. He could hear Ezra drawing choking breaths, and in them was the tone of defeat. Something struck Jason painfully in the shoulder. He twisted around to see it, and then shouted in relief. It was a huge branch, split off a nearby tree by lightning. He grabbed onto it and hauled Ezra near enough for him to throw his free arm over it. The branch dipped, and they both got mouthfuls of water, but it was just large enough to act as a buoy. Jason worked his way along the branch until he reached one end. Grasping it firmly, he began to kick with all his might. Slowly but surely they were propelled through the water, occasionally repulsed by the turbulence, but steadily making progress. Ezra did what he could do to contribute, but he was drained from his struggle. It seemed like it took hours simply to round the face of the small cliff from which they had fallen. Jason peered at the bank. It still looked too steep to climb. But as they moved a little further on, with the aid of a large wave that carried them forward, he finally spotted a place that was low enough. Behind it was another steep embankment, but there was room enough for them to stay on the shelf until the storm subsided, high enough above the waterline to keep them from getting washed away, at least for now. They had to fight violently to get the branch to approach the shore, but on this side of the cliff face, the movement of the water was more in their favor, almost dangerously so. After several minutes of thrashing towards their goal, they were suddenly hurled headlong at it. The end of the branch opposite of Jason stabbed savagely into the mud, rattling his teeth. He found that his feet just barely touched the bottom of the lake. He immediately floundered toward the bank, dragging Ezra along with him. Slipping the vine off his shoulder, he laid hold of whatever root or clump of earth would take his weight, and scrambled up the muddy bank onto the shelf. Sprawled on his stomach, he reached over the edge and dragged Ezra up behind him. They both panted helplessly near the edge of the bank for a long while. Then Jason picked himself up enough to look around. The storm was slightly less violent, but still present, and the air was cold. He turned to look at the steep embankment behind him, and realized that there was a gaping mouth in it, which he had not seen from the water. He waited for the next bolt of lightning to illuminate it for him, and confirmed that it was simply a small cave, with no further tunnels or holes in which a wild beast could hide. Ezra had lifted his head and seen it too. They both crawled in, and in a few moments had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Chapter 11. Jane paced up and down the length of the family hall. Her skirts rustled and her hair flew in wisps around her face. Mason, parked by the door, watched her with a pained expression. "Jane, just sit down for a minute," he said. "I can't," Jane barked. "I'll go crazy. Where is he?" Thunder rumbled again. She went over to the window and opened the shutter to see rain still pelting relentlessly on the pane. Night was upon the hamlet now, and the only things penetrating the darkness were the weak lanterns borne by wet figures hurrying home from the banquet hall, where the ceremony had never taken place. Shuddering, she turned away and walked slowly back into the center of the room. Mason sighed and wheeled himself over to her, taking her arm and gently but firmly holding her still. "Jane, I understand your distress, but there is nothing you can do right now, in this storm. The best thing you can do is try to stay calm and wait for the morning," he said kindly. "If Jason doesn't come back by then, we will send out search parties, and we will not stop looking until we find him." Jane bit her lip and nodded despairingly. I know. It's just that this is the worst possible thing that could have happened. Right as she hesitated, glancing at Mason's face, as we are about to make an alliance with your tribe, Jason disappears. Even if he is all right, we have probably lost our chance now. Mason shook his head. No, that isn't true. King Terran is not angry. He is just as concerned as you are. But people will talk. Yes, a few gossipers who have nothing better to do, but that is not how the rest of the tribe feels. How do you know? Jane asked, suddenly looking him in the eyes. If I were a member of your tribe, I would be suspicious and angry right now. I may be new to this sort of thing, Mason, but I'm not naive. I know what's at stake. I know how important trust is for this alliance. Jason has lost that trust tonight in a lot of people. And even if it isn't lost, it's hanging in the balance at this very moment. Mason took a deep breath and met her gaze. Then he nodded slowly. We must keep our heads and wait for answers then, he said quietly. And no matter what happens, let me just say that I know the truth about the two of you. And if worst comes to worst, I'll still stand by you and get as many of my friends as I can to do the same. Jane shook hands gratefully and then made herself move to the fireplace and sit down to wait. It would be one of the longest nights she had ever experienced. Here we change scenes. The sun had come up and was shining weakly through the cave opening when Jason opened his eyes. Rubbing them, he started to sit up, but he fell back with a grunt. He was sore all over. Even his face was swollen and stiff and tender from the blows he had received. He lay still for several minutes, trying to gather his thoughts. Finally, he propped himself up on his elbow and looked around. To his surprise, Ezra was already awake. He had gotten all the vines off of himself and was sitting with his back against the cave wall, watching him. He looked relieved when Jason sat up. "You all right, then?" he said. "I'm fine," Jason said, grimacing at the soreness as he gingerly stretched out his kinked muscles. "Are you?" Ezra shrugged. "I sprained my ankle when we were sliding off that cliff. Otherwise, I'm all right." "We're both lucky. It could have been worse." "Yes," Ezra said musingly. "Much worse." After a little while, he looked up. "Jason," he said hastily, I want to thank you. I owe you my life." Jason put up his hand to say something, but Ezra stopped him. His words spilled out in a rush. "Do not deny it. You risked your own life for me when you had every reason to do the opposite. I would have killed you before that, you know." "I got that impression," Jason said wryly. "I see now that I went about everything the wrong way, and I owe you an explanation. Ever since I was old enough to understand the plight of my tribe and of Griffyngrein, and to comprehend my own rank as Crown Prince, I have had but one goal in mind: to destroy the Terrafungs, liberate the kingdom, and bring the Ingers back to their rightful place as Griffyngrein's leading tribe. I have trained relentlessly in swordsmanship and riding. I have developed my political knowledge, studied battle histories and tactics, and learned what it is to be a leader. I planned to set out for the tower as soon as I felt fully prepared, in order to pass the test and claim the sword of the kingdom. I was certain the sword was meant for me. Rumors and tales abounded that the chosen hero would have to come from the outside, but I always refused to believe it. Any of the qualifications that an outsider could meet, I could meet too, and surpass. Only a few days ago, my mentor told me that I had developed my skills as fully as possible. It was then that, after so many years of preparation, I finally felt that I might be ready for the test. Just after this, your message came. You can imagine my emotions from then to this present hour." "Yeah, understandable," Jason said uncomfortably. It really was understandable. Painfully so. How was he actually the right one in this situation? "But I was wrong," Ezra continued, as if reading his thoughts. Jason looked up in surprise. "You think?" Ezra grinned at his expression. "Yes. Hard to believe, isn't it?" "No, I've been thinking about it ever since I came to, earlier this morning, in light of last night's events. That was very clever of you, leaving the sword behind, you know. Downright wise, actually. I'd become fixated on the symbol of leadership, not the actual position, which the test inarguably gave to you. You guessed right. I thought I could easily win the symbol for myself, and the rest would fall into place." "You definitely would have won it," Jason said. "I know," Ezra said bluntly, "but the sword wouldn't have accepted me. It didn't when I tried the night before. Just as you said, it would have solved nothing. And then you showed me you really are a lad of character, a greater character than mine in the end. So I apologize to you, Jason Fields. I will step back and let you work. You have earned this position in ways I could not see. I should have trusted the test." Jason shook the hand Ezra offered gratefully, deflating with relief. No hard feelings," he said. "Thanks for giving me a chance. I know it's been annoying." "It didn't have to be. I betrayed my own devotion to nobility and behaved ungraciously from the start." "You were a royal pain," Jason acknowledged humorously. "But it's over with now. I forgive you, and I promise I'll do my best. This wasn't exactly an easy responsibility to take on for me or for Jane. Since we have, though, we intend to do it the right way." Ezra nodded. "I believe you. But I would be lying," he added, "if I did not say that I will still be watching you. I care about my family, my tribe, and this kingdom more than I can say. Just because things didn't go as I planned does not mean I will not be as vigilant as ever, just in case." Jason smiled. "I respect that," he said. They sat in an awkwardly friendly silence, both feeling surprised at themselves, but also a great deal better than they had both been in a while. After some time, though, their minds slowly returned to their current predicament. "Well," Jason said, standing up and brushing the sand off of his hands, "the question is, what are we going to do now?" Here we change scenes. There was a great stir in the Inger hamlet as soon as the sun began to rise. Not only had Jason not come back, but Prince Ezra had never shown up to the ceremony either, and his family had not seen him. Search parties were quickly formed. Meanwhile, rumors and speculations of all kinds circulated with intensity. Early that morning, Prince Rossley came to his father with a deeply troubled look on his face. Taryn, with dark circles under his eyes from a sleepless night, looked up in surprise as the boy walked in. He usually kept to himself, and very rarely visited his father's office. "Hello, Rossley. Do you need something?" "Actually, Father," he said, I have something important to tell you." "What is it, lad?" Rossley hesitated again. "I am only saying this because we are in the midst of an emergency. I was ordered to keep this a secret, but I know I must tell you." Taryn leaned forward. "I see. Go on, son, if you know it is the right thing to do." Rossley bit his lip for a moment, then seemed to make up his mind. "Ezra came to me yesterday, seeming very cross, and ordered me to deliver a message to Jason. He offered me money, of all things, I think to help persuade me to keep it quiet, but that was silly, and I didn't take it. I did deliver the message, though." "And what was the message?" "Ezra wanted Jason to meet him at 3:30 in the afternoon, in the woods behind the hamlet, and he charged him with strict secrecy. I took the message to Jason, and he seemed bothered about it." Taryn's face was rather gray as he got up from his desk and threw his cape around his shoulders. "I've been blind." In less than 15 minutes, the king, Rossley, Jane, and the Hookies, along with several royal servants, were combing the hills behind the royal house. Rossley's dog, Rocky, was with them, but he was having difficulty tracking the missing boys because the downpour had washed the scent away. They had spread out and were a good way up into the hills when Rocky let out a howl and sprang away from Rossley's side. "What's wrong?" Jane gasped. "He's found something. Quickly, follow him," Rossley said, running after him. "Come on." Rocky made his way quickly up a slope to their left and approached an object lying in a heap on the ground. He put his nose in it for a few seconds, and then, barking, stood over it and fixed his eyes on Rossley as he and the others approached. Jane froze as she reached the object, and her face turned white. It was Jason's royal cloak. Beside it lay a longsword. Someone shouted that they had found something else. Sure enough, a little ways off lay Ezra's cape and another sword. A long moment passed before Jane had the courage to look at anyone's face. Finally, King Taryn said with an effort, "Whatever happened here, it was some time ago now, and the two of them are long gone. Take these things back to the hamlet and have them cleaned and dried. We must continue on with the search." Jane gathered up the cloak dully. She fingered the material and couldn't help but notice, even in the midst of everything, that the cloak was in no way faded or soiled by its long, rainy, muddy night on the ground. Once it was washed, it would look as good as new. She only hoped Jason would be around to wear it. Here we change scenes. Jason crashed to the ground again and got up with a groan, brushing the clumps of mud and tiny rocks off of his clothes and hands and looking vindictively at the steep bank he had been trying to climb. "This just isn't going to work, Ezra," he told the prince, who was sitting in the door of the cave. "Even if I could get up there, which I can't, you wouldn't be able to handle it with your ankle the way it is. We're going to have to find somewhere else to climb up." "We had better do it quickly," Ezra said. "We are not in the Inger hamlet anymore, and we could encounter Terfunks quite easily now." "Wait, we're not in the hamlet?" "No," Ezra said glumly. "Apparently we were running along the top of the southern border last night, and when we fell outside the hamlet, into that salt lake that my father told you about." Jason groaned. "Then we're shut out of your impenetrable hamlet the same way the Terfungs are?" "It seems that way." "Great. Fantastic." "I would love to say that I know some secret entrance back into the hamlet, but I do not. The only way to get back in will be to swim to the eastern edge of the lake, and from there circle back around on foot to the gate." "Well then, we'd better get moving. It'll be hard going with your ankle sprained, though," he added. "Then I won't go along. You can go, get help, and come back for me later." "No, no way. I'm not going to leave you out here." "And why wouldn't you? I can take care of myself." First of all, you can't if a whole unit of Terfunks swoops down on you. I don't care who you are. Second of all, how do you think it's going to look to the guards if I show up, without you, looking beat up, at the gate of their hamlet? People are bound to have figured out why we went missing by now. They might think I killed you and dropped those rocks on my head before I can explain myself." "I think they'll give you a chance, Jason. Jane will be looking for you, too, and Father will want to know what happened, regardless of what he'd do to you afterwards." "But tell me this. Aren't there people in the hamlet that will never quite get over the fact that, having gone off to fight you, I came back alone, no matter what actually happened between us?" Ezra looked taken aback. He nodded slowly. "I suppose there are." "Yeah, it's not going to look good for either of us. Nope, you and I are going to waltz in there like a couple of good buddies. That way, you won't get murdered by a Terrafung, and we both have a chance to patch this disaster up." "Very well," Ezra sighed. He looked at Jason curiously. You're loads smarter than you seem, you know. And your compliments are still backhanded, Jason returned. Ezra broke into a laugh, a real laugh, that suddenly made him look the most genuine and human he had ever seemed to Jason. Point taken. All right, then. Let me tie up this ankle, and then we should leave immediately. I can only imagine what they're thinking at home. Chapter 12. Ezra quickly made a discovery. Swimming with a sprained ankle was not pleasant. But it was possible, and he pushed through the pain. They jumped into the cold water at about 10 in the morning, and turned to the left, which Ezra said would eventually get them to the shore nearest the hamlet gate. They stayed close to the bank so that they could stop occasionally and rest, clinging to roots or rocks bordering the lake. Sometimes the water was shallow enough for them to wade. Other times they could only swim. They progressed like this for about an hour. Tired and cold, they were wading along and wondering how much longer it would be, when Ezra suddenly stopped and grabbed Jason's arm. Quiet! I hear something. They waited tensely, and then heard it again. Yes, those were voices. Rough, loud voices, accompanied by the sound of splashing water. Ahead of them, a piece of land jutted out from the bank into the lake like a small peninsula. As they watched, the prow of a rowboat came slowly into view from just beyond it. Ezra and Jason scrambled towards the bank, which was thankfully low enough to surmount. As soon as they were out of the water, they dove for a thick cluster of bushes and crouched, dripping and matted with sand and mud, watching the boat emerge. 10 Terfungs were rowing the boat, plus one who stood in the stern, overseeing them, and one, more ornately dressed, who posed in the bow, looking ahead. For now, Jason and Ezra were relatively safe. The Terfungs seemed to be on a routine mission, and did not overly scrutinize their surroundings. Besides, it was likely that they were too far away to notice the 2 grubby figures in the bushes, even if they were looking closely. The problem now was how to continue their swim safely without being spotted. If the rowers continued on their present course, they would be out in the open for a very long time, and could easily spot the 2 boys swimming at the edge of the shore. Finally, Ezra suggested seeing how far back the shelf upon which they were hiding stretched. He suspected they might be close enough to their original destination that they could progress on land. Moving as cautiously as possible, they turned around and pushed deeper into the bushes until they came upon a large boulder blocking their way. They edged their way around it to the right. They expected to find another cliff or earth wall behind it, and to have to return to the lake. But, to their surprise and relief, there was no wall. They were still more than waist deep in bushes, and they had to wind their way through a maze of boulders, but the wall had come to an end. They moved along as steadily as they could with Ezra's limp, and were beginning to emerge from this maze when they heard voices again, coming from up ahead and reverberating off the rocks. Jason motioned for Ezra to wait, and crept toward the voices. He came back with the report that there were 2 Terfungs up ahead, seemingly waiting for somebody or something, directly in Jason and Ezra's path. 2, eh? Ezra said thoughtfully. He glanced at Jason. Jason grinned. Yeah. Come on. They crawled carefully down the path, and soon, pushing aside some bushes, were able to view the enemy. The 2 Terfungs paced back and forth nonchalantly, their weapons and posture at ease. Jason and Ezra nodded at each other. For one moment, the quiet of the woods was broken by the clatter of armor and muffled curses. The next moment, all was silent again, and the Terfungs slumped unconscious against a boulder. The 2 boys, now armed with Terfung forwards, moved onward, while Jason tried to hide how excited he was to have won his first fight. They found the southern edge of the rock wall that fenced in the hamlet from the east, and slowly began to make their way along it toward the gate. But Ezra's ankle grew worse, aggravated by the swimming and the scuffle with the Terfungs, and they had to stop often. Soon after, Jason was supporting him, and Ezra was clenching his teeth against the pain. Jason wondered if they would make it to the hamlet before sundown, and if they didn't, what would happen to them that night in the enemy-filled darkness. They heard a great stirring in the woods off to their right. Footsteps rapidly approached them, followed by a sharp whinny. There was nowhere to hide. Game over, Jason heard himself saying. Here we change scenes. It was late afternoon. King Terran finally faced the decision he had been wrestling with all day long, whether or not to send search parties outside the gate. He realized the great risk of such a move, and also how difficult it would be to find the boys if they had really left the hamlet. But this was Ezra and Jason. He had no other choice as a father and a leader but to send the search parties out. As he, Jane, and the royal family stood by the gate, watching the warriors ride out, he thought back on their discovery in the woods behind the hamlet, and Rossley's secret. His jaw tightened. If Ezra and Jason were found, would they both be alive? Had he lost his son forever? Or would he, the king of the Ingers, be the father of the man who had murdered Griffyngrein's last hope? 2 hours of tense, restless waiting passed. Jane paced the halls of the royal home. She had not spoken what was on her mind ever since they found Jason's cloak, but those that saw her face could tell she was both terrified and furious. She had gotten a servant to unlock Jason's room and had found the sword of the kingdom there. Shortly after, she was seen wearing it at her side. Servants whispered. No one had realized that she could bear the sword too. The gatekeeper blew his horn. The note reverberated throughout the hamlet. Jane rushed from the royal house, followed by the royal family. Many of the Ingers were already gathered near the gate when Jane and the others arrived. It was swinging slowly open, while the gatekeepers waved their arms and shouted from the top of the wall. Inger warriors surged into the hamlet. In their midst were Jason and Ezra, very grubby and tired, mounted on 2 horses with disheveled manes. Jane identified the beasts in a heartbeat. It was Bess and Walker. Jason and Ezra had found the 2 horses running loose in the woods outside the hamlet. Jason had expended his last surge of energy to catch and calm them both. Now he and Ezra rode along amidst the warriors and smiled tiredly at the cheering Ingers. Jason caught Jane's eye and grinned, saluting cheerfully. She waved back, her hand trembling, but he noticed the sword in her face and grew a bit more serious. Jane turned her attention to Ezra. His face was drawn with pain and something like shame or embarrassment, both of which he tried to hide behind a smile. Once he caught sight of her, and she returned his gaze stonily. King Taryn stood in the middle of the lane to receive the 2. Jane joined him. Jason reached them and slid off his horse. Are you all right? Jane asked, her arms folded tightly. Yes, I'm fine, he reassured her. He grinned. Can you believe I went to all that trouble to bring the horses back? He said dryly. Jane stared at him, unamused. What on earth were you thinking? She snapped, her voice laced with tension. That stupid note? Don't worry, Jane. You just go off right before the ceremony when you know it's not safe, and you don't tell me what's going on. Is that what we're doing now, Jason? I know. I'm sorry, Jason said, holding his hands up. I thought we were going to stick together, Jane said, a sob catching her throat. She pointed at the sword. Here I am, thinking I could be the only one left, that I have to face the Hookies and the Ingers and try to be their savior all by myself, wondering how, in the name of God, I will ever explain this to our family. I thought you were dead, Jason. She broke down crying and hugged him. Why did you do that to me? I'm so sorry. It was a stupid thing to do. I messed up. So did Ezra. But we're okay now. I'll explain everything. I'm really, really sorry, Jane. It took her several minutes, but she finally pulled herself together. She laughed a little hysterically. I'm glad you're okay, she said helplessly. Jason laughed too. Yeah, I know. Jane turned to the horses and hugged them and kissed their noses. I can't believe you found them, she said, stroking Bess's neck. They basically found us. I don't know what we would have done without them. Ezra is hurt and couldn't walk there at the end. She shot a dark glance in the prince's direction. I hope you showed him how it is. It's not like that. He's fine, after all. Well, I can't wait to hear that story, she said dubiously. She took a deep breath. All right, enough of this. You need a bath and a very long sleep. Come on, don't talk to anybody. Back to the house with you. Once you feel better, then we can talk, and I promise I won't chew you out anymore. Jason, laughing, let Jane pilot him back to the royal house. Meanwhile, Ezra had eased gingerly off of Walker. Supported by a servant and eyed curiously by his subjects, he approached his father. It was hard for him to look the king in the face. A new emotion for him, for he and his father had always been close. But, mustering his courage, he finally did, when he reached him. Taryn did not look angry. His expression was a mixture of relief, concern, and a bit of sorrow. The onlooker seemed to realize that the moment was a private one, and casually moved away from the 2 of them. Father, Ezra finally managed to say, I have wronged you, our guests, and the tribe. Please forgive me. He was shocked to feel tears stinging his eyes, and dropped his gaze to the ground. The next moment, he felt 2 strong hands grasping his shoulders. My son, you are forgiven, his father said quietly. It was so comforting and so unexpected that Ezra had to swallow hard against the lump in his throat. All he could do was look at his father gratefully. The king helped Ezra to remount, and then gave the servant leave to lead Walker up to the royal house, where the servants were bustling about, preparing food and hot baths and medicines for the two tired and bruised young men.